For more than 30 years, the world believed it knew exactly who Manny Pacquiao was. A poor kid from the Philippines who punched his way out of hunger. A once-in-a-generation boxer who collected world titles like souvenirs. A smiling warrior who fought with faith in his heart and an entire nation behind his fists. It was a story so clean, so inspiring, that almost no one stopped to ask a dangerous question. What happens to a man when he is forced to live as a symbol instead of a human being? Because while the cameras followed Manny Pacquiao into packed arenas and historic fights, another life was quietly unfolding in parallel. One without cheers, one without clear victories, one where every word mattered more than every punch he ever threw. And that second life never waited for the first one to end. On fight night, Manny was allowed to be simple. The bell rang, instinct took over, and the world made sense. Hit or be hit. Advance or fall. 12 rounds, a clear ending, and a winner declared. Millions watched him move with impossible speed, throwing combinations that felt less like technique and more like destiny. For those moments, he wasn't just a boxer. He was proof. Proof that poverty could be beaten. Proof that faith could be rewarded. Proof that a small man from General Santos City could stand taller than giants. But the moment the gloves came off, that clarity vanished. Outside the ring, Manny Pacquiao entered a space where rules were invisible and punishment never stopped. Here, he was no longer judged by scorecards, but by expectations. He was expected to be wise, moral, disciplined, humble, inspirational, politically aware, spiritually flawless, and eternally grateful. Not sometimes. Always. There were no rounds, no corners, no trainers whispering advice. Every sentence became a headline. Every mistake became a moral failure. Every opinion turned into a referendum on his worth as a national hero. This was the beginning of the double life no one wanted to acknowledge. While Manny trained for world championship fights, he was also studying speeches and policy. While his body healed from brutal wars that shortened his prime, he was traveling, campaigning, listening, promising. While critics debated whether he should retire from boxing, others questioned whether he ever belonged in politics at all. He wasn't transitioning from one life to another. He was carrying both at the same time, and the weight nearly crushed him. To the public, it looked like ambition. To Manny, it felt like obligation. In the Philippines, Manny Pacquiao wasn't just famous. He was symbolic. When he fought, cities went silent. When he won, celebrations erupted like national holidays. For people who had nothing, Manny represented everything. And when a man becomes hope itself, he loses the right to fail quietly. Every loss cut deeper. Every controversial moment felt heavier. Every human flaw was treated like betrayal. And still he smiled. Still he thanked God. Still he stepped forward. What fans never saw was how isolating that life became. In boxing, some said he stayed too long. In politics, others said he never belonged. He was always too much of one thing and not enough of the other. Too aggressive for a statesman. Too outspoken for a sports hero. Too human for a symbol that was never supposed to crack. This was not a secret filled with scandal or hidden crimes. Manny Pacquiao's double life was far more painful than that. It was the quiet exhaustion of constantly switching identities. A man who had to be ruthless in one arena and flawless in another. A man who could never fully rest, because slowing down meant disappointing someone somewhere who needed him to remain larger than life. For 30 years, Manny lived like this, fighting opponents in the ring, fighting expectations everywhere else. And as long as he kept winning, the world never questioned the cost. Only now, as the noise begins to fade and the cheers grow softer, does the full picture start to come into focus. Not the myth, not the legend, but the man caught between two lives, paying a price no championship belt could ever repay. And this was only the beginning. The deeper truth about Manny Pacquiao is not found in any single fight, vote, or headline, but in the slow erosion that comes from never being allowed to step off the stage. Fame did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a responsibility, and once Manny accepted it, there was no return receipt. Behind closed doors, the physical toll was only half the story. The public knew about the injuries, the cuts, the broken bones, the concussions that accumulated quietly over decades. What they didn't see was the mental fatigue of waking up every day knowing that silence itself could be interpreted as failure. If he spoke, he was judged. If he stayed quiet, he was criticized. In boxing, inactivity loses rounds. In public life, it loses trust. And Manny was expected to win in both arenas simultaneously. There were moments when the contradiction became impossible to ignore. A fighter is trained to attack weakness. A public servant is expected to show restraint. A boxer survives by instinct. A leader survives by calculation. Manny was asked to master both, often within the same week, sometimes within the same day. The switch never became easier. It only became more automatic and more exhausting. Faith, which once grounded him, slowly turned into another expectation. He was no longer just a believer. He was a moral reference point. Every action was weighed against Scripture. Every personal decision was framed as a public lesson. The space to be imperfect disappeared. In its place grew a constant awareness that disappointment could ripple outward, hurting not just his reputation, but the people who saw themselves in him. That pressure bled into his private life. Family time became fragmented, stolen between obligations. Rest felt undeserved. Retirement felt like abandonment. The idea of choosing one path meant being accused of betraying the other. So Manny kept going, long after his body warned him, long after the joy of victory dulled, long after the applause started to sound distant. This is the part of the double life that rarely makes headlines, the fear of stopping. Because when you're built into a symbol, stopping doesn't feel like rest. It feels like erasure. Critics argued over his choices as if they were simple. Why not just box? Why not just lead? Why not just disappear and enjoy what he earned? But simplicity is a luxury rarely afforded to people who become larger than themselves. Manny's life had been claimed by too many narratives to belong to him alone. And so, year after year, he continued, not chasing glory anymore, but trying to honor commitments that kept multiplying. The wins mattered less. The losses hurt more. The noise grew louder. The man inside grew quieter. Only now, with time creating distance, is the full weight of those 30 years becoming visible. Not as scandal, not as failure, but as a cautionary story about what happens when the world turns a human being into a permanent source of hope. Because Manny Pacquiao did not live a double life to deceive anyone. He lived it because walking away from either side fell impossible. As the years passed, Manny Pacquiao found himself at a crossroads. The cheering crowds had faded into distant echoes, and the boxing gloves were slowly hung up in favor of the suit and tie of a politician. But even as he moved from one arena to another, he was never able to fully escape the shadows of the double life he had built. The fights may have ended, but the battles within him never ceased. It was in these quieter moments, away from the flashing cameras and the expectations of a nation, that Manny began to see what he had become. He was no longer just the boxer from the Philippines, the underdog who overcame the odds. He wasn't just the politician standing in front of his people, promising change. He was a man whose life had been divided, a man who had fought for others so long that he forgot how to fight for himself. He had become a vessel for others' hopes, a mirror reflecting what they wanted to see. In trying to be everything to everyone, Manny had begun to lose sight of who he was. And while his family, his faith, and his people had always been his strength, the toll of carrying so much weight for so long began to make itself known. Retirement was supposed to be a time of rest, a time to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But even in his retreat from the ring, the expectations never stopped. Now, they took on a different form. He was expected to be a perfect mentor, a perfect father, a perfect representative of his country. And no matter how many moments of peace he sought, there was always someone else pulling at him, demanding more. As Manny watched his children grow, as he spent time with his wife, Jean Key, and as he attended religious services that had always anchored him, the weight of the years became clearer. He had fought for so long, in so many different battles, that the fight to simply be a man, without a title, without a cause, felt both liberating and terrifying. His heart still beat for the people. That was never in question. But now, in the twilight of his athletic career, he was forced to confront something he hadn't been able to in decades. Who am I without the fight? Manny Pacquiao, the boxer, was easy to understand. He was the embodiment of courage, of strength, of sacrifice. But Manny Pacquiao, the man who had given everything, taken everything, and still felt a quiet hunger for something deeper, was a mystery even to himself. And then came the reckoning. The political career he had embraced so passionately brought its own set of challenges, both personal and public. The contradictions between his roles as a boxer and a politician continued to haunt him. The double life didn't just mean switching between identities. It meant being stretched beyond his limits, constantly torn between who he was expected to be and who he truly was. In public life, Manny was expected to be above reproach, a figure of unwavering moral authority. In the ring, he was a warrior, vulnerable and human. But when he stepped away from both, who was left? Was he a man of politics? A man of faith? Or was he simply Manny, the fighter, the father, the Filipino who once dreamed of being more than his circumstances? Now, as he reflected on his past, Manny understood the price of that double life. Every victory, every championship, every campaign rally had come at the cost of his own peace, his own sense of self. And the battle had never been more personal than it was now. After all the titles, after all the applause, what remained when the world stopped watching? Manny knew that the true fight, the one that no crowd would ever cheer for, was about to begin. It was the fight for his soul, the fight to redefine himself not as a symbol, but as a man, the fight to be whole again. For so long, Manny had lived for others. But now, for the first time in decades, he could see a path ahead, a path where he was no longer the boxer or the politician, a path where he could find peace in simply being himself. And as the final chapter of his extraordinary journey began to take shape, the world would no longer look to Manny Pacquiao as a hero. Instead, they would see him as a man who had lived a double life, not for fame or fortune, but because for 30 years he had believed that the world needed him to be everything. But now, finally, Manny Pacquiao was ready to find out what it meant to be nothing but his true self. The battle may have ended, but the journey toward redemption had only just begun. As Manny stood on the edge of this new chapter, the quiet stillness of his home in General Santos City became a sharp contrast to the roaring crowds he had grown accustomed to. The last decade had shown him a life beyond boxing, but also a life of profound loneliness. It was as though after all the accolades, the endless rounds of applause, the titles and the public battles, Manny had forgotten how to simply be a person, not a symbol. He began to understand something he had never truly allowed himself to see before. Being Manny Pacquiao the man was just as important as being Manny Pacquiao the icon. As he spent more time with his family, he noticed the small moments he had missed. His children's laughter, the quiet talks with his wife, the moments of peace that once felt impossible to come by. He finally started to feel the weight of what he had given up, what he had been running from during those long years in the spotlight. And it was in those moments of reflection, of being surrounded by the people who loved him for who he truly was, not just what he could give them, that he felt a profound shift within himself. But redemption was never going to come easy for a man who had lived his life in the public eye. Manny had spent his entire career building a version of himself that the world admired, a version of himself that was always fighting for something, always striving to meet the needs of others. The battle for self-acceptance would not come with a medal or a trophy. It would come with difficult decisions and quiet courage. Manny knew he couldn't walk away completely from everything he had built, and he wasn't sure if he even wanted to. But he also knew that he could no longer live under the burden of other people's expectations. The public, the fans, even his own family, they all wanted something from him. But Manny had given so much of himself for so long, And now, it was time to reclaim what was his. In the stillness of his retreat, he began to reconnect with his deeper purpose. He still had a voice. He had always used it in the ring and in politics. But now, he wanted to use it in a different way, to advocate for the things that truly mattered to him: his family, his faith, and the people who had always stood by him, even when he didn't deserve it. Manny began to question everything he had once known to be true. Was it the boxing that made him great? Or was it the values he carried with him, the courage to rise each time he fell? Was it the political platform that defined his power? Or was it the small acts of kindness, the moments of quiet service, that had the real impact? The truth was, Manny had always known the answer. He had just been too afraid to acknowledge it until now. And so, as he stepped back into the public sphere once again, not as the world champion, not as the politician, but as Manny Pacquiao, the man, he did so with a new purpose. No longer bound by the constant need for validation, no longer fighting for approval, Manny began to share his journey of self-discovery with the world. He talked openly about the cost of fame, the toll it had taken on his body, mind, and soul. He shared his regrets and his triumphs, the lessons learned from years of sacrifice. But most importantly, Manny began to speak about the importance of finding balance, the balance between the world's demands and the quiet peace that comes from within. For those who had followed his journey, the shift was noticeable. No longer was Manny just a boxer or a politician. He was becoming something far more powerful, a voice for those who struggled with their own battles, for those who had lived lives of expectation, and for those who had lost their way. He was becoming a symbol of redemption, not because he had won every fight, but because he had learned the true power of vulnerability. Manny Pacquiao's greatest fight wasn't against an opponent in the ring, but against the pressures of living up to a myth. And with every passing day, he grew closer to finally winning the fight for himself. As he looked out over the city that had once been the setting for his greatest struggles, Manny Pacquiao smiled. Not because he had defeated the world, but because he had finally made peace with the man in the mirror. In the months that followed, the transformation in Manny Pacquiao was more than just physical. It wasn't about the loss of the ripped physique or the years that had slowly caught up with him. It was about something deeper. He began to cultivate the life that had always been just out of reach. A life where, for the first time in decades, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Manny found joy in the simplest of things. He spent hours with his children, teaching them not how to box, but how to live, to honor their roots, to respect the struggles of others, and to embrace the power of giving without expecting in return. He took long walks with his wife, Jinky, through the streets of General Santos, talking about everything and nothing at all. They spoke of their early years, their dreams, and how they had built something together, not just a career, but a family. Despite the quiet, Manny's influence never disappeared. His story was still one that resonated with millions. People still looked to him for inspiration, and while he no longer stood in front of them as a champion in the ring, he stood before them as a different kind of champion. He became a symbol of hope in a new way, not for his achievements, but for his resilience. The resilience to face the truth about who he had been, to confront the flaws that came with the fame, and to walk away from the lies he had told himself. Manny began to speak openly about the mental toll fame had taken on him, the pressure to be perfect, to always be more than human, the expectation to be a constant source of light, when in truth, he was just as much in the dark as the next person. He shared the battles of self-doubt, the days when he felt like giving up, and the loneliness that accompanied his ascent to the top. His vulnerability became his strength, and in embracing it, he showed the world that true power didn't lie in never falling, but in getting back up after every fall. Manny's return to public life wasn't about redemption or seeking validation from masses. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about finding balance in a life that had once been all-consuming. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to anyone. Instead, he used his platform to teach others the importance of self-care, of family, of love, and of living authentically. He became a voice for the millions who had lived under the weight of expectation, those who felt they could never be enough, those who spent their lives chasing after something that always seemed just out of reach. Manny Pacquiao, the fighter, the politician, the symbol, was now simply Manny, the man who had lived a double life and emerged stronger for it. Looking back at his boxing career, Manny could now see the moments where he had been at his most vulnerable, the times when the pressure felt suffocating, the losses that stung far deeper than just a knockout. But those were the moments that had shaped him. They had taught him that victory wasn't the end goal. It was the strength to keep going when the world told you to stop. It was the courage to face the truth of who you were, not who everyone else wanted you to be. In his final reflection, Manny understood that his true legacy was not the titles or the fame. His legacy was the way he had fought, not just against opponents, but against the expectations that sought to define him. His legacy was in how he had come to realize that sometimes the greatest victory is simply being at peace with who you are. As Manny Pacquiao continued to share his journey with the world, it wasn't in search of accolades or applause. It was in the hope that someone, somewhere, would hear his story and realize they, too, could find their way back from the shadows of their own double life. He had spent decades fighting in the ring, but the real fight, the one that mattered most, was the fight to be free. Free from the pressure, free from the expectations, and finally, free to be himself. And in that, Manny found peace, not in the applause, not in the titles, but in the quiet moments where he could simply be Manny Pacquiao, the man who had learned to live for himself. The end of one life wasn't the end of his story. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one where Manny Pacquiao found out that sometimes the most important fight is the one you don't see coming, the fight to live a life true to yourself. As Manny Pacquiao moved further into his new life, the shadows of his past no longer loomed over him. The boxer, the politician, the symbol, those identities had not disappeared, but they no longer defined him. They were parts of a larger mosaic, fragments of a journey that, in its entirety, had been both extraordinary and deeply human. What remained now was the opportunity to shape his future on his own terms. The next chapter was quieter, yet more profound. He immersed himself in projects that truly mattered to him, ones that reflected the values he had always held but rarely had time to act on. He started a foundation dedicated to education, providing opportunities for children who grew up like he had, without resources, but with a relentless will to succeed. He spent time mentoring young athletes, not just in sports, but in life, sharing his story of triumphs and failures, of rising after every fall. His family became his world. There were no more distractions, no more demands pulling him in 1,000 different directions. He was present for his wife, Jean Key, in a way he had never been before, nurturing a partnership that had weathered the storms of his public life. He was there for his children, teaching them not just about success, but about the value of humility, hard work, and resilience. For the first time in years, Manny truly felt like he was home, not just physically but emotionally. Even as he found peace in his private life, Manny still felt the call of public service. But this time, it wasn't driven by the need to prove something to others. It was driven by a genuine desire to give back in ways that weren't tied to his past glories. He didn't want to be known as the man who gave speeches, who held rallies, or who stood behind a podium. He wanted to be known as the man who quietly helped others, the man who lived by the principles he preached, the man who acted out of pure, unselfish love for his people. He continued his political career, but with a different mindset. His work was less about winning favor, more about creating lasting change. He became a voice for those who were often overlooked, those who lacked the platform he had once used to command attention. Manny used his influence to advocate for the underprivileged, focusing on education, healthcare, and the empowerment of the youth. His mission wasn't about political power anymore. It was about serving those who needed it most. Manny's story, however, was not one of perfect peace. The challenges of living authentically didn't vanish the moment he shed his former identities. There were still moments of doubt. There were still days when the weight of his past choices pressed against him. There were days when he questioned whether he was doing enough, or if he was simply too far removed from the world he had once conquered. But what Manny had learned, in a most profound way, was the importance of balance. He had learned that even though the road to self-acceptance is not without its struggles, it is always worth traveling. He had learned that his worth wasn't measured by the applause, by the titles, or by the expectations of others. His worth was in the quiet moments, the ones no one would ever see, where he was simply himself, human, flawed, and ever-growing. Looking back, Manny could see the full arc of his journey. From a hungry boy in the streets of General Santos to the champion who took on the world, and from the politician whose name was on every tongue to the man who finally understood that true strength comes not from never falling, but from the courage to rise each time. Now, as he stood on the edge of a life defined not by what the world expected of him, but by what he had chosen for himself, Manny Pacquiao found himself at peace. Peace not just with his past, but with his future. The fighter who had once feared the end of his career now understood that the end of one chapter was simply the beginning of another. The journey was never truly over. It simply evolved. In the end, Manny Pacquiao didn't just leave behind the double life of a boxer and a politician. He left behind the idea that he needed to be anything other than who he was. The greatest victory of his life wasn't the titles or the fame. It was the courage to embrace the man he had become and the peace that came with it. And in that, Manny found a victory far greater than anything the world had ever given him. The fight may have ended in the ring, but his journey toward true freedom, toward being himself, had just begun. As Manny Pacquiao embraced his new path, he began to realize that his journey of self-discovery was something that would never truly be finished. It wasn't a destination, but rather an ongoing process, one where every day was a step toward understanding himself and the world around him more deeply. His life, once marked by relentless external pressures and the expectations of others, had now become a testament to the quiet, everyday choices that define who a person really is. Manny's commitment to his family deepened as he spent more time with his children, teaching them not only about the value of hard work, but also about the importance of kindness and empathy. He became more than just a father. He became a guide, a presence they could rely on, someone who was genuinely there, not just as a provider, but as a role model. He helped them navigate their own dreams and challenges, passing on the lessons that had been instilled in him as a child, to always push forward, to face difficulties with a positive attitude, and to remember that no dream is too big when you have faith and perseverance. Jinky, his wife, saw the change in him as well. Their relationship, once overshadowed by the demands of his career and public life, flourished as they rediscovered one another. No longer were they two people caught up in the whirlwind of fame, but partners building a life together, hand in hand. They shared quiet moments of joy, laughter, and love, something they had both longed for, but had only recently begun to fully appreciate. Through it all, Jinky remained his steadfast support, a reminder that no matter where life took them, they had each other. Manny's work in the political sphere continued, but with a much more focused and intentional approach. His public service was no longer about accumulating power or positioning himself for future success. It was about truly making a difference, even if the impact was subtle. He worked quietly behind the scenes, helping to bring better education systems to the rural areas, improving healthcare access for those who could least afford it, and championing policies that gave a voice to the marginalized communities who had often been overlooked. His fame didn't define his actions. His desire to serve did. And even as he spoke less about the glory of his boxing days, Manny's influence continued to shape the country. People admired him, not for his titles or past victories, but for the courage he had shown in stepping away from the limelight to focus on the real work that mattered. Manny wasn't just remembered as a fighter. He was remembered as a man who had faced immense pressures, learned from his struggles, and found peace by choosing to live authentically. Yet, there were still moments when Manny felt the weight of his past. He had given so much of himself to others, had worn so many different faces for so long, that sometimes he wondered if he would ever truly feel free of it all. Would the world continue to expect him to be the figure they had built in their minds? Would they always need him to be the hero, the unbreakable symbol of hope? There were moments of doubt, of hesitation, where the scars of his double life resurfaced. But each time, Manny reminded himself of what he had learned. The journey toward peace was never about escaping the past. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and growing stronger in the process. Every challenge he had faced had been a step toward becoming the person he was today. And as long as he continued to walk with integrity, love, and faith, he would never lose sight of who he truly was. One quiet evening, as Manny sat on the porch of his home, watching the sun set over the hills of General Santos, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The struggles, the sacrifices, the long days spent fighting, both in the ring and in life, had all led him to this moment. He wasn't the boxer who once dominated the world stage, nor was he the politician whose name echoed through the halls of power. He was simply Manny, a man who had learned to live for himself, not for the applause of others. In that stillness, Manny understood that the greatest victories were the ones that couldn't be measured in titles or achievements. The greatest victories came in the form of personal peace, of accepting the journey that had brought him here, and knowing that no matter where life took him next, he would be okay. Because in the end, Manny Pacquiao had fought the only fight that truly mattered, the fight to be true to himself. And that, in itself, was the greatest triumph of all. As he leaned back in his chair, gazing at the horizon, Manny smiled softly. His journey wasn't over. It would never truly be over. But now, for the first time, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. At peace, at home, and finally free. The end of one chapter always marks the beginning of another. And Manny Pacquiao, the man, was ready to live it fully, one day at a time.